Summary. We have gone through a lot of findings in this class. So what do they mean? The globalists say that attention is needed for a subjective experience because this is how sensory information gets globally broadcasted to many different brain regions, including the PFC. But then why do we experience the background of a visual scene even when we aren't paying attention to it? The globalists say that this is because we summarize the scene statistically, and that this summary information might need only minimal attention in order to be represented in the PFC. This feels a bit odd to think that we're experiencing these summary statistics rather than an actual image of the world. Furthermore, lesioning the PFC doesn't abolish one's ability to perform visual tasks. Apparently, one continues to be able to represent visual information without global broadcast. Perhaps it's because most of these lesions are unilateral, and they do little to completely knock out PFC functions. But it also seems possible that the PFC is doing something else to support conscious perception rather than global broadcast. Now, the localists, on the other hand, say that attention is not needed for subjective experience. These experiences are determined by activity in early sensory areas. Attention is just for allowing things to enter the PFC for access. First of all, the view that only the things you pay attention to go into the PFC is not quite right. Even the things that you weren't paying attention to are represented. But more importantly, early sensory activity is also not completely unaffected by attention. In fact, depending on the perceptual load, such activity can be modulated by attention quite a bit. Also, when we consciously access our sensory information, we change both the attended and unattended sensory activity too. And yet, we experience the world as rather stable and uniform as we access and pay attention to different information. So identifying our subjective experiences with early sensory activity alone doesn't seem quite right either. Perhaps the trouble is that our conscious experiences are quite complicated. It may be impossible to identify them by activity at a single cortical level. Recall from class 2 that we make saccades as often as several times per second. So in the early visual areas, our representations are not so stable. And yet, don't we see the world as relatively stable? But when we move our eyes, our conscious experiences do change. The content of our visual experience seems to be in a sense stable, and in a sense not quite. So how do we map this to one single set of representations? And why wouldn't the brain use them all together as needed? Likewise, do we see colorful details in the unattended periphery? Maybe we don't really represent as much detail as we think we do. But at the same time, it feels as though those details aren't missing either. That certainly is the impression, at least some of the time. And when it comes to subjective experiences, our own impression seems to be quite important. So do we or do we not see those details, really? The answer might be yes and no. In the sense of representing the details, we don't. But in the sense of our brains estimating that it has represented the details, we do. That is, we need both the early sensory and the PFC activity. But unlike what the globalists say, the role of the PFC in conscious perception might not be a matter of just boosting or broadcasting the sensory signals. Instead, it monitors early perceptual processes. That is, it estimates and tells us how much sensory information we really have. This could be why we sometimes don't actually visually represent that much detail, and yet feel like we do. Because this metacognitive mechanism may not always be 100% correct. The colorful details in the periphery may be a case of overestimation, or what we call inflation. That speckled hen could be another case. We feel like we see all the dots because this is what our PFC tells us, even though we have not processed each of them in detail. And all of this seems to fit with the lesion data, as well as our understanding that unattended, task-irrelevant information can reach the PFC. And remember, when we say PFC, we usually think that the parietal areas are similarly important. The critical point is whether conscious experiences depend on early sensory areas alone, like the localists argue, or whether they depend on areas outside of the sensory regions, that is, the prefrontal and parietal areas, or what we call the association cortices. So our conclusion is, having a conscious experience of a stimulus may involve more than just representing that stimulus in the brain. It could also depend on how the brain recognizes that the stimulus is being represented by itself. Or at least, this is one way to interpret the evidence reviewed so far. In the final class, we will see how we can further develop these ideas into a more coherent theory.